Hey YouTube, how's it going? Mike the Manic Geek here. And admittedly, I've been kind of dragging my feet about making this video because I wasn't really sure how I wanted to structure it for you guys. But I figured, screw it, let's just give it a go and see where this video takes us. So, this is going to be a sort of crash course on how I home brew beer. Now, I'm gonna state this up ahead of time. Don't take this as gospel. This is more or less just a crash course overview of how I go through the brewing process, because I know a lot of you guys have been asking to see more beer videos, and admittedly, I've been wanting to bring more of them to you. So, without further ado, let's dive in and take a look at how home brewing is done extract style. Now, to start with, you're gonna need some basic supplies in order to actually produce the wort, or what is basically the unfermented beer. So you're gonna need a 5-gallon kettle to boil everything in. You're gonna need some sanitizing equipment. You're going to need some form of thermometer. I would personally prefer a digital one, but a candy thermometer like this can be handy to have as well. You're also gonna need some straining equipment to work with. And you're also going to need a graduated cylinder like this one. It doesn't have to have any hashes or measurements on it, but you will need this for later on. Now, the other thing you're going to need clearly is your ingredients to make your beer, which in my case, I pick up at Southern Brewing and Winemaking over in Tampa, Florida. It's not too far away from where I live. It's maybe a 20-25 minute drive or so, but they have everything that you need there to get started with a home brewing system, as well as all the ingredients that you'll need. Check your local markets to see if you guys have any local brewing supply stores, because not only do they have the stuff you'll need, chances are they'll probably have some brewing classes that you can take there as well to learn the different styles of brewing that are out there. We personally use extract brewing in our home because it's space saving and it's less time consuming. Now, apart from your primary set of gear here and the ingredients for the beer, you're also gonna need some muslin sacks to stuff everything into. And it's basically like a cheesecloth is what you're putting your grains and your hops into. And on top of all that, you're gonna need 5 gallons of water. Now, you could technically just measure this from your tap, but I personally prefer to go to a grocery store and pick up 5 gallons of purified water there. Purified or distilled, either way, I just prefer to get it bottled because it's already pre-measured. It's easier to measure everything out. It's just a matter of convenience. You guys do it the way you want to do it, but you're going to need 5 gallons of water total, split up into 2 and 3 gallon batches. The 2 gallons is going to go in this bucket when you actually start making your beer, while the other 3 gallons is going to be set aside in the fridge, chilling down for later on once you've finished all the boiling stuff that you're going to be doing. So the first thing you're going to be doing is you're going to be taking your grain, which should have been run through a mill at this point. Your brewing supply store should be able to help you take care of that. And you're gonna get it into your muslin sacks. And after you get the 2 gallon batch to an initial boil, as soon as it starts boiling, take it off of your stove eye and start steeping your muslin sack full of grains in this tea. You're gonna let it sit for a certain amount of time. Can't remember it off the top of my head. I'll have the duration down here below me in the video. Once it's steeped, you're gonna pull the sack out and you're gonna be using your straining tools to scoop it out and make sure you're pressing out as much of that grainy steeped goodness as you can out of that muslin sack back into your bucket. It's not really super necessary, but it's my OCD thing to go with it. Once you get your initial muslin sack out with your grains, you're gonna get it back on the stove eye and you're gonna get it boiling again. Once you get it boiling again, you're gonna take it back off the stove eye, and that's when you're going to introduce your malt extracts. In this case, we use liquid and dry malt extract to make this beer. And essentially what this does is it cuts out a lot of the time that it takes to make a proper wort for your beer. And like I said, it's more time efficient and it's more space efficient. And since we live in an apartment, that's critical to us. This does make the process more expensive, however, so keep that in mind if you decide that you want to get into something like this. Now, once you've stirred in your liquid and your powdered malt extracts, it doesn't matter what order you throw them in there, you just get them in there. Get them stirred in, get them mixed in. The reason you want to do this off of the heat is because you don't want any of these malt extracts to burn or stick to the bottom of your kettle, because what's going to happen is you'll get burnt sugars in here basically, and you'll start getting some undesirable flavors, undesirable colors, and you don't really want any undesirables in your beer, of course. You want it to just be the beer you want to brew. But anyway, after you get all of your malt extracts stirred in, you're going to get it back on your stove eye for a third time, and that's when you're going to have to do a lot of careful monitoring of what you're doing, and that's where your thermometer is going to come into play. Once you get your beer up to a nice boil, you want to keep it there, and you want to monitor it using a thermometer like this one, but preferably a digital one, so that you have something that sticks up out away from the steam that comes out of your kettle while you're boiling. So once you get your malt extract stirred into the pot, you're going to get it back on the stove eye, and you're going to get things boiling again. Once you get everything to a set temperature, you're going to need to keep it there, because you don't want the heat getting too out of control on your wort. Because what will start to happen is once you hit a certain point in the boil and you start getting more and more of the fermentable sugars out of your malt extract and out of the initial steep that you got, you're going to notice that it foams up significantly, and you need to keep that under control. It might at this point be a good idea to have a spray bottle filled with cold water that you can use to spray down the top of the foam to sort of break surface tension, as we found that this helps out significantly when you're brewing your beer. Now, once you get things up to your fixed boiling point, this is where you're going to start introducing the hops to your beer. If any of you guys have ever had anything from Dogfish Head called 60-minute or 90-minute IPA, they call it that because that's the duration of the boil time during which they continuously add hops to the beer. The earlier you add the hops, the different effects you're going to get out of the hops in the beer. The later you add them, the more the effects will change. It's a question of aromatics versus flavor content. So again, I'll go into that with more detail in a future video where I'll go into a specific beer that I'll brew with you guys. But for right now, the generics of it is you add in hops during this point of the brewing process. Your directions for your beer should tell you when in the boil you will add the hops, and it'll look something like 60 minutes or 5 minutes next to it. That shows the amount of time that's left in the boil when you add the hops. In most cases, a beer is going to have about a 60-minute boil time for adding the hops in. So if it says 60 minutes next to it, that means you add it in right when the boil is stabilized and started. At this point when you're adding your hops in, you should be doing this in a muslin sack, by the way. You're going to keep occasionally stirring the beer to break surface tension, and have someone standing by, preferably with the spray bottle ready to help you break surface tension, just in case you need to get things under control quickly. Now, you're also going to be manipulating your stove eye's temperature dial a little bit to get things dialed in. And again, your mileage will vary with your stove. You know it better than I do. Now, once you go through that part of the brewing process, honestly, that's the hard stuff done. After this point, you're going to take your wort off of the heat, and you're going to get it into preferably a portion of your sink where you have it plugged up and you've got some cold water set in there. Set the kettle down in the water, get some ice in there preferably as well, and you want to cool this down within a reasonable amount of time. I would say anywhere from 20 to 30 minutes tops is how long it should take to cool this down to roughly 135 degrees or so. Once your wort's cooled down to 135 degrees, you're going to go ahead and pour it into the next phase of its life. Now, before I get any further with the brewing process and how this all actually works, I want to make sure you guys understand one simple concept here. Sanitization is the key to making sure that your beers turn out well every single time. Everything that touches your beer after it's done boiling should always be sanitized. Now, in this case, we keep a thing of 5-star cleaners on hand. One is their PBW cleaner. The other one is their Star San, which is an acid sanitizer that you use after you clean everything. The reason you do that is because no matter how good you clean something, there's always going to be some kind of little bacteria or germ or something that's on your equipment that you're using. The more you can keep things sanitized here and clean, the more likely you are to not have any issues with your beer getting infected and developing flavors that aren't entirely unlike baby vomit. Now, once you get your wort down to an effective temperature, 135 as we mentioned before, you're going to get it into this bucket. This is essentially a 6.5 gallon painter's bucket that I picked up as part of my brewing supply kit at Southern. But if you're industrious enough, you could go ahead and just get your own 6.5 gallon to 7 gallon painter's bucket and it would achieve the same results. Plastic is fine in this case. I did, however, go with this particular bucket because it does also have some gravity measurements on the side over here, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But I do actually like that this list is here. Once you get the wort into this bucket, you're then going to introduce the other 3 gallons of water that you started chilling down earlier, or at least you should have. The reason for chilling it is so that you can then rapidly get the wort down to an effective temperature to introduce your yeast into the beer. In this case, you want your wort to be around 80 degrees Fahrenheit before you introduce your yeast, because if it's too hot, you could actually kill the yeast before it even gets into the beer. Similarly, if it's too cold, you could also wind up shocking the yeast and killing it that way. So ideally, 65 to 80 degrees should be the temperature range in which you introduce your yeast. If it's a little colder than that, unfortunately, there's not a whole lot that you're going to be able to do other than keep it sealed, keep it clean, and wait for the temperature to naturally elevate a little bit. If it's a little too warm, you could technically add a little bit more water, but what that's going to do is it's going to alter the gravity of your beer, which at this point is something that you should be testing before the yeast gets introduced into the beer. Now, the most effective way to measure the gravity on your beer is to use a graduated cylinder like this one that we mentioned earlier. It doesn't have to be sanitized at this point because essentially anything that goes into here you could dump off, but if you wanted to reintroduce this back into your wort, definitely make sure this is clean and sanitized before you put anything in here, because if it hasn't been, that bit of the wort is now sacrificed to the sink gods. Now, you get some of your beer in here. To do that, you're going to use a very basic siphon kit like the one we've got here. This tube basically just goes into the end like so. You drop this down into your beer, and then you'll start siphoning the beer up through the tube, and as you push down, the fluid's gonna rise up this tube and go into your vessel here. This is, again, a point in time where it would be nice to have someone helping you do this. You can be done by yourself, but it's just a little cumbersome. Once you get everything in here, you're going to take what's called a hydrometer, and you're going to drop this into your wort. Now, a hydrometer is basically telling you how much more dense the fluid is than water, how much more heavy it is. And it'll be heavier because you have a bunch of stuff in the water. You've got your malt extract, you've got the hops that you've boiled off into this, you've got the grains that you steeped in this. So all of that is going to increase the gravity on your beer. The point of doing this here is you want to take a measurement at the start versus a measurement at the end when the beer is completed, because those numbers can help you determine what the alcohol content is going to be on your beer. And that's what I really like about this fermenting bucket, is that the graph that shows you on the side gives you original gravity and final gravity numbers to show you more or less what your alcohol content is going to be on the beer you just brewed. Now, there is one other thing that I wanted to cover here before we get too much further into the actual brewing process. At some point, you're going to be introducing yeast into this beer. So what you should have on hand is a couple of yeast packets that you'll have called smack packs that you'll be introducing into the beer. You're going to be sanitizing them, and you're going to set them to the side for about, basically at the start of your boil should be when you set the smack packs out. To prep them, it's literally what the name of the product sounds like. You smack the pack, and what it does is it releases a basically yeast nutrient into the baggie of yeast, and lets the yeast start propagating before you introduce it into your beer. Sort of like an easy yeast starter kit, if you will. But you definitely want to make sure that those smack packs are sanitized, because as you pour them off into your wort after you're finished, there is a chance that once again they could pick up something foreign that's stuck to the outside of that bag, and that could produce some very undesirable results in your beer. But yeah, after you get your gravity measurements, basically all you have to do is take those smack packs that we discussed earlier, open them up, and dump the yeast into the beer. You want to make sure that you don't get the secondary pouch that's on the inside of the smack pack dumped into the beer on accident. Now once you have your wort into the bucket, you've got the yeast going and everything, now is when it comes time to seal it up and make sure that nothing is going to go wrong over the course of the next 2 weeks that the beer ferments. You want to get a lid onto the bucket, but it needs to have an opening in the top of it with some kind of rubber gasket around it to make sure that it seals correctly. That's another reason why I went with the pre-packaged kit that came with the painting bucket from Southern, because it already has the accommodation drilled into the top with a really nice rubber seal that makes sure that nothing else is going to get into the beer. But what you do at this point, you take an old jar, similar to this one. This one was an old honey jar that I had lying around. You're going to take a length of tubing like this. I'll post some measurements for this down in the video description below, so you know inner and outer diameters to work with. And you're going to get a little hose clamp like this one. Again, all of these supplies can be had at a brewing supply store, at least the one that I go to. Your individual mileage may vary. But you're going to fill this with water. Now, what you're going to do, the way this all sets up, this filled with water, clip right here, tube in here, down into the water. Other end goes down into your fermentation lid, your fermentation bucket lid. The reason for this is because what's going to happen during fermentation is the yeast is latching on to all the fermentable sugars and stuff that's in your beer, and it's farting out CO2 and alcohol. Now that CO2 has to be able to vent out of the bucket, because if it doesn't, you're going to have your lid bulging up on you, the beer is going to explode all over the place, and it's just not a fun time. You do need to let the CO2 escape at this point, because not only will it make a mess, but it could produce some undesirable results in your beer. This is going to be something that's pretty easy to keep tabs on. You basically just want to make sure that the end of this tube doesn't go down into and touch the wort, just like you want to make sure that the water in here is changed every 2 to 3 days or so, mostly because you don't want any bacteria that would grow in this water making its way back up your vent tube and back into your bucket. Now I suggest a method like this because my experience with using an airlock style system on my fermentation vessels has not been good. Matter of fact, I used one exactly one time and that was it. I switched to this system, and from there on out I've not had any problems at all with the beer. But essentially, yes, at this point this is going to be the long waiting game. You're waiting for about 2 weeks of fermentation in order for your beer to finish itself out. 1 week of what's called primary and another week of what's called secondary fermentation. You can do a couple of different things with secondary fermentation, but if there's really nothing that your recipe calls for, you can basically just let the beer rest for a little bit until gravity stops dropping on it. And by dropping, I mean the number gets closer to 1. What'll happen is as your beer is going through and fermenting, you're going to want to take gravity measurements every couple of days just to make sure that everything is still progressing along properly. Again, make sure it is that you sanitize everything that touches the wort. Even with the yeast in there, make sure everything is Okay, so once you've put in your 2 weeks of time with fermenting, it's time to get your beer into bottles. First thing you're going to do before you even get to the bucket right here is you're going to want to sanitize all of your bottles. Sanitize, sanitize, sanitize. That is the key to home brewing. Make sure your bottles get sanitized, preferably using your sink. A dual basin sink works really well. If you don't have anything that's dual basin, Rubbermaid totes can work for this as well, the smaller ones. Fill 2 vessels, basically. One with your washing agent and one with your sanitizing agent. Now, basically, what you use for sanitizing your bottles is a little scrub brush like this. We have 2 of them here because when we brew, we're usually brewing at least a team of 2 people, and it does make things go by a little bit more quickly having one person scrubbing out the bottles while for the washing agent and the other person scrubbing out the bottles with the sanitizing agent. You can set these to dry in a typical dish rack system. You could also use your dishwasher if you wanted to, but if you put bottles in the dishwasher to dry, let them air dry. Do not use the heated dry setting for your dishwasher because your bottles will get all the loose bacteria and stuff from inside there. Instead, what you would do, you fill a spray bottle with your sanitizing agent and spray down all of the racks on the inside of your dishwasher and let it dry out for a little bit. Rinse it down with some fresh water in the spritzer, and you should be able to set your bottles in a dishwasher to dry with relatively little difficulty. Now, some of the tools you're going to need for the bottling section of this are, of course, your bottling bucket, a length of tube running off of the spigot here, long enough to suit your needs. Wherever you set this, your mileage may vary. But you're also going to be using a hard tube very similar to this one that has a fill port at the end of it that requires you to depress this into the bottom of the bottle in order to get beer to actually start flowing. Now, this is something else that you're clearly going to want to sanitize before doing anything else with the beer, because it has to pass through this into the bottles. If this has anything in it, then there's a possibility that any number of your beers could get something into it. Basically, if it's going to touch your beer after it's been boiled, sanitize, sanitize, sanitize. Speaking of sanitizing, guess what else you get to sanitize? Your bottle caps. These are also purchasable separately. Typically at a brewing supply store, they'll carry stuff like that. You can also order them through certain online shops. Same thing with your bottles that you're going to be setting your beer into. You can do that a couple of different ways, but the way I prefer to do it is just save the bottles of beer that I drank. In most cases, this will work well for your needs. Just make sure that the bottle has a cap top to it. If it's got a cork top, you would need a separate corking system to make sure that you could reuse that bottle. Also, make sure that the beer that was in the bottle does not contain any form of Brettanomyces or Lactobacillus or any sort of wild bacterial strains like that. Because even if you clean out and sanitize the bottle, there is still a possibility that those bugs could still be latched onto the glass and will affect the beer that's present inside of them. Or at least the likelihood is high enough that you probably shouldn't risk it with those styles of beer anyway. Once your bottles are prepped, it's time to get your beer from the fermenting vessel into this bucket right here. The only difference between this and the fermenting vessel that you used is there's no lid, and you got a spigot here on the bottom to start gravity filling your beer into bottles. Now, one thing I want to interject and mention really quick before I move on to these tools right here is you're also going to be preparing a sugar reduction mix to go into your bottling bucket before you introduce the beer into it. Basically, this is just a 5-ounce pack of corn sugar that you can get from brewing supply stores. You can even use corn sugar from your grocery store if you wanted to. Just measure out 5 ounces, get a small liquid reduction going with it, and then you let it cool down for a little bit. Once it's cooled down to an effective temperature, you introduce that into your bottling bucket first, then introduce the beer over top of that. Now, essentially what that's going to do is it's going to act as a sort of kickstarter for the yeast, because once you bottle the beer, you're going to be conditioning it in the bottles. Because if you guys notice, when you open a can or a bottle of beer, traditionally there's a bit of a hiss or sometimes like a splashing sound that comes from the container. It's because beer is carbonated. Now, in this case, whereas before we were venting the CO2, now we want to build carbonation and keep it in the bottle, because that carbonation is what's going to get the beer actually tasting the way it's supposed to taste. Those of you that have ever experienced a truly flat beer before, or a rested ale as they're called, know that unless that it was intended to be that kind of beer, they are extremely difficult to drink and typically don't taste good at all. You can then start introducing the beer into the bottles. Typically the way we like to do this is on a relay system. The Manic Misses will sit and actually fill the bottles, and then I will get to capping them as she passes them over to me. Now there's a couple of different capper styles that are out there that you guys can use. This particular one, which is a hand version, was the one that came with our bottling kit, but we found that this one was a little unstable, and it made me honestly very nervous that I was going to tip over the bottle of beer while I was using this. If you're confident in how steady your hands are, this solution is fine. However, I prefer more of a traditional base plate mounted solution like this one. This one I actually got from my late great grandfather after he passed. This was one of the things that he had down in his basement. And this particular solution, if you can find one like this, it's up and down adjustable. It's got easy corking action on it. It's easy to move up and down and get locked in place. And you can set it on its own dedicated stand to make this a lot easier to keep in storage somewhere. This is an excellent solution, and I highly recommend this one. It also makes the job go by a hell of a lot faster because it's a lot less unwieldy than something like this. All right, so now that everything's gotten into the bottles, unfortunately, there's more of a waiting game. You are going to be bottle conditioning the beers for a minimum of a week, average of about 2 weeks, I've found, for most of my beers. Now, unfortunately, there really isn't an accurate way to determine whether or not your beer is actually carbonating up properly at this point, so after about a week has passed, take one of your bottles of beer and open it as a tester to see how it's coming along. If you like where your flavors are, if you like the level of carbonation that you've developed into the beer, then chances are you're good to start getting the rest of your containers into a refrigerator and get them chilled so that they're prepared to serve and drink. Because, you know, that's what you do with a beer. You drink it. Now, if it's not quite ready yet, or you notice that something is just a little off with it, it's okay to let them sit for a little bit longer before you're committed to getting them all in the fridge. Because once you get them chilled, the yeast is going to slow down to nothing at that point. Anything that's left in the bottle once you've bottled it is going to basically be inactive moving forward, unless you're using something, like I said earlier, a wild bacteria strain that is able to survive being in colder temperature conditions. So now let's assume, for the sake of argument, that your beer is all done. It's all ready to go. I'm going to go ahead and grab Pere Jacques and show you guys the beer that I made using this method that I went over with you. Well guys, here you have it. Pere Jacques in its completed form. This beer finished out to right around 8.5% alcohol by volume, so it's still decent enough in alcohol that you can really enjoy it after a glass, but you can have at least one glass without feeling absolutely hammered at the end of the whole thing. Now, as far as the specialty grains for this, we went with Weyermann Cara Munich 1 for our base grain, as well as about little over 8 pounds of liquid and dry malt extract combined together. We also went with 2 pounds of Belgian candy sugar, the clear stuff, but where we deviated from the base recipe was right around here. We held back about 8 ounces of that candy sugar and then reintroduced 16 ounces of R.W. Knudsen organic pear juice in during primary fermentation to make sure that we were going to get some more of those fermentable sugars back into the beer, but also give it like a big punch of pear juice flavor in there. Now, the other place where we deviated was in the hop bill. The hops for this was 1 ounce of Northern Brewer hops at 60 minutes in the boil, and then 1 ounce of German Hull melon hops with 5 minutes left in the boil. The German Hull melon hops versus the Saaz hops that this recipe originally called for were used because they would express the pear juice a lot more prominently in this beer. Now, another thing that was changed here was during secondary fermentation, we introduced another 8 ounces of the pear juice. This was to give the beer a little bit more of the pear aromatics through, as you were smelling the beer. And I gotta say, in general, I'm really pleased with how it turned out. It's a little darker and cloudier than I would have preferred. This could be possibly a result of us taking a little too long to chill the wort down. It could also have been a byproduct of the pear juice. Either way, the beer has this lovely aroma. Followed by this nice spiced pear juice bite at the end. It tastes like you bit into a spiced pear. It's really quite unique as triples are concerned. Now, the yeast that we used for this beer was Belgian Abbey 2. Now, this one was selected because it pronounces the alcohol content in the beer a little bit more prominently than other yeast strains do. And it also adds in a bit of like a dark, meaty fruit flavor, which in the case of this beer accentuates that Munich malt that was used as part of the base for the beer. All in all, this recipe came together really nicely. And it's something that you can do in your average apartment kitchen without having to spend a lot of time to do it other than just waiting for it to become what it's supposed to be. But anyway, guys, that's going to conclude it for this video. Again, I know this was really long, but there was just a lot of content to cover with you guys. I even originally said on Twitter, I thought about making this a 2-part video, but I just really don't feel like that would have done it justice. Hit me up in the comments down below. Let me know what you did and didn't like about this. Also, let me know if you have any more questions on home brewing. Maybe I can get you guys pointed in the right direction or explain some things that I didn't go over as thoroughly in this video. I do plan on doing more content like this for you guys, so this is just the beginning. Expect more videos like this and expect them to be better quality than even this one moving forward. But anyway, guys, don't forget to do that thumbs up, thumbs down, share, and subscribe thing like you do, how you do. And as always, I will catch you guys in the next video. Cheers.